Well, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the globe. My name is Jim Pfister, and you are viewing the Technology Implications of Internet of Payments, a live webcast sponsored by the Storage Networking Industry Association. Let me introduce everyone who will be talking today. Like I said, I'm Jim Pfister. I'm an independent contractor for SNIA, and I'm also the principal of the Decision Place, my own company. We also have Glyn Bowden online. Glyn, say hello.
Hi there. Thanks, Jim. Yep, so I'm Glyn. I'm from Hewlett Packard Enterprise. I generally look after AI and data and all things emerging technology, and I'm really looking forward to this one.
Excellent. And we also have Richard George, the CEO of HLPS. Richard, say hi.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm CEO of Health, Life, Prosperity Shared, a recent company that's doing some great things. Looking forward to presenting.
Yeah, we'll learn a little bit more about HLPS and about all the interesting things that you're doing as we move forward today. So just a little bit of blocking and tackling for those of you on the BrightTalk platform. There should be some buttons on the bottom of the screen right underneath the presentation. One of those might be very useful for you. It will expand your screen from the postage stamp size that you have up to a more viewable aspect ratio. So you can certainly look at that if you want. You will also notice some things down the right side that I'd like to highlight. One is the attachments and links, and I see some of you have already found. This presentation is available as an attachment, and you are free to download it. And then there are also a questions box over there. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time. I'll be moderating that, and I will interject the questions as they come in, as long as they're relevant to where we are. Let me give you just a little bit more blocking and tackling. This material contained in this presentation is copyrighted by SNIA unless otherwise noted. Member companies and individual members may use this material in presentations and literature under a variety of conditions that you can read there. This is a project of Storage Networking Industry Association. We're here to talk about industry standards and some of the implications of Internet of Payments and how that might affect cloud storage as well as your business. The authors, presenters here today, none of us are attorneys. Nothing in this presentation should be construed as legal advice. If you need legal advice, I'm sure that you have a good local barrister that can help you out. And the information presented herein represents our personal opinions and current understanding of the relevant issues. We're not assuming any responsibility or liability for how you use this information, although I think that you should be able to use it to your advantage. SNIA-At-A-Glance, we are 185 industry-leading organizations. We have about 2,000 active contributing members, and we reach out to about 50,000 information technology end users and storage pros worldwide. So we have a good reach. We certainly appreciate all of you being here today, and we'd like to get into the material. So SNIA will be here to educate, support, and promote, allow you to understand some of the different requirements that are going on and how to collaborate with each other in the industry. So we will be providing this information. We hope that you enjoy what it is that we're going to discuss today. And with that, let's get into the content. I will hand it over to Richard and let you go.
Hi, everybody. Right, let's have a look at the agenda. We're looking, today is really much about value and how we look at initially digitizing value, what digital assets are, where it's all going. We're going to look at payments anywhere further down the presentation. So a lot of the early stages of this presentation are very much about the vision of the future of payments, and then towards the second half of the presentation will be very much about some of the technology which Glyn will be covering. So without further ado, I shall move on to the next slide. Let's look at the digitalization of value. First, let's a little bit about us. I forgot that bit. It's a UK-based fintech company, and we're really looking at developing use cases to solve big societal problems. And in the UK at the moment, one of the big problems is housing. And we're looking to see how we can apply digital asset solutions to streamline the buying of houses for those that are struggling to get onto the housing ladder. So that's a little bit about us. But first principles, core principles for me are very much that we all see great ideas, we all come up with great ideas, but quite often they don't really solve any problems. So bear in mind throughout this, what the problem is really about process inefficiency. So our whole goal is to disrupt process inefficiency, and that's one of the mantras. The next thing is always to consider an idea, and I love this cartoon. The king's going into battle, they've got their bows and arrows, and the salesman's trying to sell him a Gatling gun, and of course he's ignoring them. So always consider a good idea, never just throw it out. Right, well, let's look at a bit of history. So value is very much defined by an item scarcity. It's all about supply and demand. And it all started in the early days with, me on my farm a couple of 100 years ago. I had a few chickens. The guy next door had, maybe the farmer next door maybe had some goats, and we would do a bit of a barter. We'd do a bit of a deal. Well, it gets a bit of a problem after a while because you can only eat so much goat's milk or drink so much goat's milk, you can only eat so much chicken. So then we had to go to the market where we would find other ways of actually of obtaining goods, and that's where the whole sort of the coinage thing, the token thing came in. And banks have been virtualizing money for years, for many years where you had the reserve asset ratio, the gold standard, and all these other aspects where banks could lend money up to a certain level beyond that which they had deposited. And so they've always been creating virtual money. So this virtual wealth has been, we're all used to it. It's been represented by a token. It's this cash. It's these banknotes. But remember, banknotes are not currency. They're contracts. Banknotes are IOUs. On every British pound note, there is, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of either £5, £10, £20, and so on. And what does that mean? It's a note. Note. It's a contract. Like in France, they have notaries, contract lawyers. So it's actually an IOU, and a lot of people forget that or don't even realize it. So anyway, so let's look at digitizing both the value and the contract. And let's call that contract a smart contract, and let's make it self-executing with rules that are wrapped in a code around it. So this is the way we see things going forward. So let's have a look at transactions. And transactions generally are traditionally cumbersome. If you buy a house, look at the process that you have to go through. If you want to transfer money, traditionally, it's been quite a lengthy process to send money from one country to another, from a member of the family to another member of the family overseas. Well, of course, that's changing. We are seeing a lot of development. We're seeing TransferWise, we're seeing Stripe and all this stuff helping to solve and add value or add speed and streamlining that process. And then, of course, we've got Libra. What's going to happen with Libra when billions of people are able to start transacting value? It's a very interesting opportunity, but it means that financial inclusion is likely to be on its way. So, but let's look at, we're looking at currency and money here, but let's look at digital assets. Because digital assets, if you can associate them with real world assets, I don't know if you know, but there's something like $260 trillion worth of real world assets out there that are very illiquid. Property is illiquid. Art is relatively illiquid. The items that you have, the valuables that you have, everything around is pretty illiquid. So what we're talking about here is how you can digitize those assets, and then how you can divide those assets into fractions, and that those assets can then be utilized, and the way they are utilized determined by smart self-executing contracts. And all the transactions, of course.
What makes that interesting, right, Richard, is, to a large degree, currency is not locked to any standard right now. most of them are, it's a variable value based on the comparative value from one nation to another or from one asset to another. What you're talking about is actually starting potentially to reestablish standards or value around some of the digital currencies by actually linking them back to a real physical asset.
Yeah, absolutely, because the problem with the digital currencies that we've all experienced in the last few years is volatility, and quite often that volatility is because of speculation. And of course, there's always going to be speculation within any digital asset. But once you have something that's real, you're transacting a value that has more solidity to it. It's a safer bet. If you have a home that you've fractionalized into digital assets, it's much more tangible than it is with pure speculation and speculative currency, for example. And so, for example, I'll come on to it in a minute. In fact, I'll come on to it now because it's a relevant point. And that is, if we look at what's already been happening, for example, with security tokens, the early stages were linking property, trying to release tokens onto market exchanges and hoping to raise money and that sort of thing. But it's not been terribly successful. It's very much about I've got an asset, I want to sell it on a public exchange, but there just aren't the buyers there yet. It's immature. It's too early. It's a bit like 1996 to 2000. I remember that well, with fantastic solutions, but nobody using them. There's no traffic, and if you've got no traffic, you've got no adoption. If you've got no adoption, the investors are going to be pretty annoyed. And it crashes just like it did with the dot-com crash, and just like we've seen with some of the ICO issues. And then of course you've got with the STOs and the ITOs, you've got the backlash from the regulators, the SEC and the FCA, etc., that followed, and all the court cases that have been going on. So basically, stage one was a bit too early. But where it gets interesting, and coming back to your point just now, is where you utilize digital assets within a solution, which I think is what's starting to happen now. It's whereby the value transfer within the solution, so perhaps cash is used to come into the solution, so maybe buying property, but perhaps the asset that's being exchanged is within a platform, and therefore you're linking the digital asset to a live fiat currency. And what we're seeing is certain attempts that we've all experienced in the last few months, like Fortnite, for example, with Apple, and Google, and the way that they've been trying to do the value transactions within the app, compared with having to go through Play Store, App Store, and the battle that's going on there. So this is, I think, the early stages of where the disruptors could be. They could start being disrupted, and that case I think is a very interesting one. So this is what we call a hybrid solution, and the hybrid solution is where, like I said, you fractionalize the asset, you exchange value, perhaps within a platform in a use case, any use case, but when it comes to entry, it comes in as dollars, gets converted, and when it comes back out, it's dollars or pounds or euros or whatever. So that's Although even with that, you actually see that value translating across what you would consider a barrier. In the Fortnite case, you would see people actually selling Fortnite items on eBay, and so there's the ability to that's effectively an exchange or a currency exchange in some way, shape, or form. So as you talk about these hybrid solutions, you're really talking about moving from a currency exchange of several dozen foreign currencies currently globally to millions and millions of currencies potentially. Yeah, absolutely, and we'll come and take a look at that in a bit, Jim. I think this is what opens up. The box, was a bit like Pandora's box. Is it Pandora's box? Are we opening up here something very revolutionary and would have a major impact on economic thinking? And my belief is that it does. And as we move into phase 3, and this this is the point where you might have value appreciating or depreciating within a solution. We have this breaking out. So stage 3 is where you start to have the ability not necessarily to exit into pounds and dollars or euros. It's where the assets then themselves might be readily exchanged. So you might have a fraction of the property that goes on to an exchange, a regulated exchange, and perhaps that asset is exchanged for beyond currency. It could be Bitcoin. It could be anything. And that's the important bit. It's what is the value at that point of the transaction. And when the SEC and the FCA are really happy to regulate this stuff, and why not? Because the biggest problem with non-regulation is the amount of people that have lost money in the last few years. Yes, some people have made a lot of money out of the volatility of crypto, but an awful lot of people have lost. So I'm a firm believer that regulatory approval and working within the rules and being consumer focused is all important within the solutions that you build or develop, design, whatever. So in this stage of phase 3, consumers are becoming introduced to receiving, holding, exchanging, gathering these digital assets, and as well as digital currencies that are now coming onto the market. The Chinese are doing it. And it won't be long before the European Bank does it, the Bank of England does it, and they're all following suit because I think they have to. But they've got to recognise that these multi-channels, if you like, which is stage 4, where you've got mass adoption. So you've got, imagine millions of types of assets. So wherever you're walking, you could walk into a Walmart, and as you walk into the Walmart, your phone starts pinging. You're getting all these offers and micropayments, all these little assets from all different suppliers potentially, and then you can go and use them and spend. But this is the interesting case. It's a bit like the early days of TV, where you had 3 or 4 channels in the UK, and then suddenly the internet opened up. You got millions of channels. I think the same is going to happen with digital assets and value transfer. And this is crucial because all of a sudden, if you've got millions of types of assets, well, you can't manage them. You as an individual in your smart wallet or your smartphone or your personal device, it'll just be too complex. So here we open up a situation where things become very much automated, where individuals are achieving, hopefully, the best possible value at the point of transaction. Value is determined at the point of the willing buyer and the willing seller. And I love the cartoon on this slide where the police officer stops the car and he says, "Does your car have any idea why I've pulled you over?" And I'd like to add to that and say, the guy driving the car says, "Well, actually, yes, officer, and by the way, he's already taken a $100 fine because he recognised I was speeding. Did you not?" So we have this this opportunity for this automation, as well as the combination of Internet of Things, which we might come on to in a bit, and all the different devices and the values being automatically managed on our behalf, which is quite scary. So, this gathering, holding, it's a bit like walking around and receiving, walking around and giving. It's a very interesting concept, but I think it's one that we're going to have to get used to in the coming years.
The interesting aspect of that is that you're back to chickens and goat milk again. I have a variety of currencies, and they have varying values to me, and they certainly have varying values to people who might want them. And now I'm back to the barter and exchange. Well, do you want Bitcoin? Do you want Fortnite items? Do you want U.S. dollars? You have that ability to actually manipulate and bargain on a very vast scale.
Absolutely, and then soon we'll come on to the behavioural influence of the way that the digital assets can be used. But just before that, I'll just hand over to Glyn to go through the born in the digital environment and how to define value. Glyn.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. So, perfect. So as we kind of look at assets, it's very easy to see in the physical world that you have a tangible asset that you can then sort of consume and it has some sort of value to you. So it's fairly simple there. When you start looking at digital assets, it starts to become a problem. So as we discovered earlier on when we looked at the kind of criteria of value, it's often defined by its scarcity. And as the piracy in the 1980s and 1990s of movies and video games and everything else that happened back then told us, is that digital assets aren't scarce because you can make infinite copies of them and the copies don't degrade. Which brings a problem when you're trying to create that scarcity. So how do you do that? Well, you have to make the digital asset scarce. There's a couple of different technologies we can apply to doing that. So firstly, you can limit the distribution of it. So if you control the platform whereby it's being distributed from, then you have control over who maybe has access to that platform. That's one of the reasons why we're seeing a move towards streaming services rather than content download services, because a streaming service can turn you off when you stop paying the bill. There's obviously people that are trying to work around those sorts of things, but that's the model. It's around limiting the access to that. You're limiting its distribution to your members. The other thing you can do is you can protect the item. And we see that happening a lot more, particularly with sort of blockchain technologies, where you have a lock and a key. So you encrypt it and then you issue a certificate. And then the certificate can expire, which means you only have access to that digital asset whilst you hold that certificate and whilst the certificate remains valid. At that point, you then restrict the distribution of that key. And what we're seeing as well is we're breaking those keys into many parts and distributing them to multiple individuals or multiple wallets, if you're looking at the blockchain wallet, for example, which means only when you reassemble that key, so when the owner of the data, who has one bit of the key, you, the consumer, has another bit of the key, and possibly even a third party who's the licensee and validator, comes in with their part of the key, you actually construct something that's able to unlock the content and allow you to view the data. What this allows is that we can do things like issue data to institutions. So like, imagine a hotel where you're subscribing to the TV channels or you're downloading content within a hotel. Then the hotel will have a key, the media owner will have a key, so the person who produced the content, and then the person in the room has the third part of the key and gets access to it. We can also do things like geo-restrictions and things in that way. All of this, though, depends on identity management, and we'll come on to talk a little bit more around identity management later on, but it comes down to proving who you are and that you are the person that's supposed to be holding the part of the key that you have. So what I'll do is I'll hand it back to Rich to carry on, and we'll get back into some of this again in a second.
Thank you, Glyn. Yeah, I mean, I've called this the fashion shoe principle because what we're looking at here is, you've got identity, but you've also got certification, if you like. You've got the immutability of the record, for example, on the blockchain. So if we're looking at special edition trainers, they could be an appreciating asset. They have been. They've been shown to be. So you can fractionalize, the trainers or the sneakers, whatever you call them around the world, and certify it with the history of its transaction. But the whole point here is that you can subdivide it. You're creating scarcity if it's a non-fungible digital asset. So it represents it and only it. It's like a piece of art. There's only one Mona Lisa. And so you have this opportunity to digitize items, such as collectible shoes, and then have a secondary market for it, if you like, the ability to then sell off, trade off, or transact value from those assets. So we're retaining the scarcity, but accelerating liquidity, and that's the important bit. And that's the scary bit, because all of a sudden, if you're making $256 trillion of world assets liquid, it's almost like a stock. You can go and buy it and sell it instantly. But with this, what's extra special about this is you can wrap it in special rules. And I've put an example here, where influencers of all types, organizations with particular interest groups, could be issuing digital asset rewards that can only be utilized in certain ways. So, for example, we have here, can I exchange my carbon credits for filling my car? Yes, of course you can, as long as it's a Tesla or a Honda Hydrogen, but obviously not if you're filling it up with a gas guzzling V8. But you could take this behavior a million times further. Imagine a world where digital assets and value can only be used to support sustainability or diversity, or to improve health in places that desperately need that help. So you can focus value and value transfer into the directions where the originator of the value intends it to go. And I think that's very, very powerful. So the future is interesting very, very interesting, very complex, very automated, very clever, but very interesting. So let's look at another aspect of it. So I've got these assets now. I love the example of I watched the Sweet Talk presentations by Scott Nelson at Sweetbridge. I found it absolutely fascinating the thought that, for example, a prawn farmer in Surat Thani in Thailand, deep in the jungle, has got the ability, or could have the ability in the future, to put assets from his house to support the growth of his business. Because if he's supplying prawns to Tesco or somebody in the UK, a big supermarket chain in the UK, it could be a long time before he gets paid. So this opportunity for developing countries and the people within developing countries to be able to kind of self-borrow to expand their operation to meet the demand by setting up their own rules. I give a bit of my house, I set, a plan for 90 days because I know I'm going to get paid in 90 days. And then, I have to pay maybe a little bit more back, but it's certainly better than going to the local, robbing banks that you tend to find in these third worlds, or the dodgy loan shark. Anyway, so there's that. Then there's payment holidays. So you imagine a situation where you've got, you're buying a house and there's asset releases, and then you suddenly lose your job, or you become sick. There's an opportunity here where perhaps you can have a payment holiday and then you're returning assets automatically. So there are lots of examples and lots of use cases where these assets, not just self-borrowing, but also releasing back when your circumstances change. So you're looking at mobility, you're looking at liquidity in ways never seen before is where we see it going. So,
well, and I would think that the reach of that would be very attractive as well. You gave the example of the farmer in the third world. Think of all the micro lending and other asset payment opportunities that would potentially come up from willing investors that would invest a small portion in order to be able to advance that particular person. I think that really opens up opportunity that it is nascent, but I think the digital currency really provides an accelerator to that.
Oh, absolutely, because you're talking about peer-to-peer arrangements. You're talking about sort of instant transfers of value, and to affect that on a global basis is, we've all seen how Bitcoin works. We've all seen how instant this situation can be. But when you're opening up to hundreds of thousands of different types of assets, and then in the future, the solution builders and providers, the wallet holders, the up and coming Zigloos of the world that are holding these wallets of all these different assets. We've seen them. How is that going to be managed? It's the exciting bit. Somebody is going to do that well. And here's the opportunity as well for governments and organizations to directly engage and to directly reward. So you have there's a big opportunity here for disintermediating. The certain large organizations remaining nameless that take money for profiling or whatever, you can see a greater opportunity here for peer-to-peer engagement. And the slide that we're showing now is really about government services. If you've got these payments happening so rapidly in asset exchanges or value exchanges, the governments are obviously going to want to tap into this, but it also makes them efficient. So you have, once the interoperability standards, once you get Ethereum's able to process its transactions and scale, which we all know is going to happen. The whole industry is going to scale. We're going to see a fantastic opportunity for government entities to tie into it. We're seeing a test in UK with Her Majesty's Land Registry, where property titles have been transacted in 10 minutes. Consensus with HMLR have done a property transaction in 10 minutes. And in the UK, you'd be lucky to get that done in 3 months. Between solicitors, lawyers, and absolutely everybody, but they've tokenized the title, associated the digital asset to the token, and they've done a test. Now, that's the way that the governments can become efficient, because They can collect their fees, they can manage the property titles, they can do all this stuff very, very rapidly, but in a digital asset exchange world. And that's what they're planning. And I suspect, that's what other governments are planning. So the benefits to government are enormous. It's all about efficiency, it's all about streamlining, and and it's all about payments anywhere and from anything. We're talking about Internet of Payments, but we're talking about things. I mentioned the joke about the car, the police officer stopping the guy, and the car's already taken the money from the other car. The car identifies that it's speeding and has actually pulled the money from the driver. And there are a myriad of potential applications for that. In this horrible COVID-19 world, I started to go to supermarkets, and they have the green light for entering the building, the red light for please stay there because we need to keep the social distancing. Now, just imagine what else you can do with the switching of information between the individual who's walking around that store, like I said earlier. And then, we're talking about Internet of Me. My son is studying neurology. At one stage, I think he wanted to be a brain surgeon, but I think he's a bit too squeamish for that. But he's saying, "Hey, Dad, they're going to be able to calculate using your genes." And I'm far too old to even contemplate that. But the future could be, the transaction could be coming from me, not from my phone. Now that's a bit wild, and I apologise for going off on one there, but it gives you an idea that we are, I think, in summary of my bit, looking at a revolution of the way value is going to be transferred, the methods of transfer, but the golden opportunity for solution providers, and call it super CRM in the super barter on steroids world is an exciting future, and we want to be part of it. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Glyn. So Glyn's going to, I think, excite you with a bit more technology speak, because that is obviously something that doesn't cross my shoulders. So Glyn.
Thanks, Rich. So we talked earlier on around the need for identity, so the need to know who we are and be able to identify the people that are involved in the transactions. So that's the very first stage of any of these transactions, is proving who you are, and we'll look at the technology stack as we kind of move forward in a little bit. Then those individuals need to agree on the terms of the transactions. So they're defining your value for yourselves. So if I have a piece of technology that I want to sell, and somebody has something that I would like to exchange, and I think they're of equal value, we can decide between us that that's the value and that we want that transaction to take place. We don't need to depend on a predefined currency from anywhere else. We then need to provide the payment details. So I need to let the person know who's buying my technology stack or whatever it is they're buying from me, how they're going to transfer their currency to me. So how do I take ownership of their value, and then how do they take ownership of my value? So then I obviously provide the means to acquire that asset. And we talked a little bit about how we can protect that when we looked at creating digital asset scarcity. So we're now saying, how do I provide you with the key for that in a secure way? We then commit the deal. And as soon as we commit it, we immediately exchange. So Rich just talked about the kind of velocity that we can start moving deals at, and Rich talked about the property deeds and titles exchanging hands very, very quickly in the UK as part of this experimentation. And that brings a lot of value with it. Not only does it mean that we can complete things much quicker, and so that we can therefore do more transactions in a shorter period of time, which if each transaction has a particular value, then you're kind of increasing your value each time you do that. There are other more tangible benefits to it as well, which I'll come back to in just a second. The last stage, obviously, is issue the confirmation that the deal has been completed and ready for audit. So you have something that's transparent and you can see where you are in that stage. You know it's completed. So combining those last two, and this was actually from a conversation Rich and I had earlier today when we were discussing this presentation. We were just talking around value, and we were talking about sort of housing exchanges, and Rich and I have both sort of bought property recently. And it's a very stressful thing. There's high levels of stress involved when you're trying to buy a property or when you're doing any kind of high-value exchange. It's a tough thing to do. And the reason is because there's a lot of unknowns, and there's a lot of it that's outside of your control. So the more transparency you can add, I mean, if you think about it, stress comes from the not knowing what's going on, and the longer you're in that not knowing state, right? So time times pressure, essentially. So the quicker you can do that, the less time there is to kind of accelerate that pressure, and the more transparency is, the less pressure there is as well. So being able to execute this in a very transparent way, very quickly, means that you immediately kind of reduce the stress that's involved in those executions as well. And being able to do that means people are more comfortable doing those trades. So they're more comfortable doing those sorts of executions, and it becomes a way of life. You define value naturally, you exchange value naturally. So I'll hand back to Rich in a second to talk about an example of this, but essentially we're talking about zero trust transactions. And zero trust means that nobody in that circle has to trust anybody else in that circle. The technology and the safeguards that are wrapped around it, so that certificate exchange, the smart contracts that Rich alluded to at the very beginning, all of that comes together to create that security ring, if you like, where you know the asset is only going to exchange hands, and the means to do that exchange of the value that you're giving for as your tokens or whatever it may be, and you gaining access to that asset, all of that will happen simultaneously when you've all agreed that the exchange will happen. There's no way of anyone interjecting and sort of taking their piece and not having yours. There's no need for proxies or anything like that for this. So we'll look at the technology stack in a minute. Rich, you want to just run through this example quick? I think it's a great one that highlights that.
Yeah, certainly, Glyn. This is a real situation. I had a message from my stepson. Basically, I'm a bit short of money and I need to have it. Can you help me out and send it across? Before 12 o'clock. I think it's 2nd of September or something like that. And of course, first things first, being the tight-fisted devil that I am, I got my other half to give him a call, because he wasn't in the same room. He was 150 miles away. And we quickly realised, and I thought, it can't be him, because I know he's got plenty of money in the bank. So he's a bit like myself. So in essence, we found that through this intermediary, we've got a trusted connection asking me for money, but it wasn't him. And I was absolutely gobsmacked. So I played the game, and I went back and said, of course I'll do that. Can you give me the sort code and the bank account details, and I'll send it across. I'm in a meeting at the moment. I'll send it across a bit later. Well, of course, I was already onto it. I realised it was a scam. But the problem is, this is a trusted, for me, is a trusted environment. Obviously not mentioning any names, but it's fairly obvious, but it's a trusted environment. So how does this happen, And I think this is the golden opportunity with the technology and the identity and the peer-to-peer type of opportunities that Glyn's talking about. I mean, Glyn, I hope I've covered that to what is needed on that particular point, but I think it outlines the danger of intermediation. So over to
well, and I think it's safe to say that history can tell you that when people lose trust in the currency rapidly loses value, and so that's only going to get exacerbated in the digital environment. If there's no trust in a particular digital currency, that digital currency very quickly would become valueless.
Absolutely. We see that happen to physical currencies as much as we do digital currencies even. So we only need to look back at some of the European currencies before the euro took over to see kind of where that happened and where the economy would drive the value of the currency down. Where people making exchanges within that country would have no control over that. So if I was selling bread in that country to somebody, I have no control of the currency that they have to pay me with has gone down. Whereas this mechanism really empowers them both to decide, well, what value am I placing on what I'm exchanging with you? So it goes back to barter, but it takes that sort of volatility away from some of those transactions, because you can both decide what those values should be. So let's kind of dig in a little bit to the technology stack, and that's a great example, Rich. I love the example because firstly it's a real one, and we know that these things happen. But if you go onto kind of YouTube or any of your favorite video channels and just Google responding to spam emails, you'll see some great examples and some very funny examples actually of just how prevalent these things are, how these men-in-the-middle attacks occur. And it comes down to the fact that you're trusting the mechanism by which you're doing the transactions to behave in the way you expect you to behave and to have already identified the people you're transacting with. And that's a reasonably dangerous thing to do when you don't understand the platform that you're interacting with. So going back to the point we've made sort of several times, and not what's next, the key is having that of both an identity manager, so how you authenticate, and so the authentication is proving that who you are. So you have a credential that proves you are the individual you say you are. So that credential is very often multi-factor. It's broken into different parts. It could be username, password combined with a certificate of some kind that's on a device that you own. It could be a one-time password, assuming nobody's intercepted your phone. There's lots of different ways of managing that kind of initial authentication. That will then grant you pieces of that certificate or that key that we talked about previously that you can then match to other pieces. The next part of authentication, or the process, is the authority. So once you've authenticated yourself and you have proven who you are, you then need to go in through an authority manager that says this person has the rights to make the transaction they're making. Now, if it's between individuals, that's a fairly tough one to do. We've all traded on things like eBay, and we kind of have to trust the buyer that I'm getting a box with an iPad in it or wherever it is I'm buying, rather than the box with a brick in it of the same weight. So there's a degree of trust in terms of those sorts of transactions. When you start looking at this model, you can have third parties validate that transaction. Now, we talked about the housing market in the UK, where Rich is talking about the examples of the experiments that are being done there. That's a perfect one to look at, because there's a third party there that can validate the individual with this identity has ownership, and therefore the right to sell this property or portions of this property. So we have a third person that can then interact with that contract to validate that both sides are actually genuine. Now, no assets are exchanging hands, and that third party doesn't need to get an asset. It may get a slice of the pie. It may get something that a commission of some sort, which means that there's value in it for them. But also it means that they can then validate that, firstly, they understand that the owner is the owner, and they're able to make the transaction, and they can vouch for that on the system, as well as they are then observers of that transaction. So they know that the new owner has now taken ownership of the asset that's being transferred. And so when somebody else comes along and says, the original person's trying to sell me this asset again, they can no longer sign that contract because they have the evidence to prove that it's already transacted. So that's part of the authority manager, and that's where we sort of see smart contracts be multi-peer or multi-party contracts, whereby you have the two people performing the exchange and you have a third that's validating the ownership of that. That third party doesn't have to be an individual, or it doesn't have to be a person that's manually making decisions. You can build business rules and processes there that will go off and check those things itself. Maybe check against the market valuation to make sure that the price that's being offered is realistic, and it's down to the two people to agree, but then the second person will have the confidence that actually I've pushed this through a further process that's validated that it's worth what you say it's worth, it's in the condition you say it's in. All of these different rules can be built into these contracts so that when we actually get to doing the transaction, we have those processes that can validate it and be transparent and visible by everybody. The third part is, of course, you can have that transparent ledger, so that tamper-proof ledger that sits in the middle, be visible to everybody. And you can select what's visible on that ledger as well, so that anyone can come in, and much like in the UK, anyone can go to the land registry and look up who owns what. It's public record. And so that same level of detail can be visible here on this ledger as well. It doesn't have to be sort of occluded, but you can choose which bits of data are occluded to which parties. So even down to the individuals that are doing the transactions, you can say, well, you only get to see this bit of information that's valid for what you're doing. And then the person that's on the other side of the transaction maybe gets to see a bit more to make, to provide the security. And then members of the public, or even HMRC, who are then collecting the taxes on these transactions, get to see what's going on and get to sort of automate the process of, I know this transaction is now happening, that means I need to tax this person a certain amount of land duty that they need to pay now because they're ownership. So all of that happens as a part of the transaction piece. What sits underneath all of that is the storage layers. And that's where you may have digital content storage, which is digital content that then gets associated with a series of digital IDs. If you look at a digital purchasing scheme where you're buying something, then that one item will be a copy or an instance of that item is created, not necessarily duplicating blocks. We can use things like deduplication and pointers to manage this. But an instance of that will get created, and that will be associated with a digital ID. That's the one that you own. And when you no longer want to move it and you want to sell it to somebody else, your digital ID is removed from that copy and another one is created for the new owner. So that's how you kind of manage in the movement of assets world. We talked about the streaming world as well, in which case you can have one piece of digital content that has many identities associated with it, or an owner identity that has many authorities associated with it, saying that lots of people then get access to this in certain ways. And again, we can define read-write access and all the usual kind of CRUD pieces that go with that. And then the transaction storage is storage outside of the ledger that you can go and query. So it's something that usually has an open API and those sorts of things associated with it, so that other applications can start plugging into that. Looking at ledgers, particularly talking about blockchain technology, the transaction speed of blockchain technology and certainly querying isn't great, so you tend to have a secondary store that sits behind it that assists on that. This is what can define values. When you have that access to that transaction storage and it's transparent, you can start building models and doing things like AI and machine learning against it to look at trends in values and associated values and everything else. And you build up historical pictures of what's happened from the transaction perspective with certain assets and certain types of assets. This means the market pretty much drives itself because you can build intelligence into the way that platform behaves. If you think about that third individual I mentioned that can do the validation of the contract, so that third party, that could be a model that's built on the transactions previously. So you know, for example, if you're looking at housing, that suddenly there hasn't been a massive spike in pricing. This person isn't doubled the property value overnight when none of the other trends suggest that's something that should happen. And if he's committed other acts against that property, maybe he's added assets to it, he's done the kitchen up, or he's repainted it, or he's put a conservatory on the back, whatever it may be, those transactions could also be put on the ledger and stored as part of that transaction storage, showing the incremental increases in value. So that when it gets sold on to the new owner, that value gets passed along with it. It's transparent and can be seen. So that's kind of the technology stacks we're looking to. I've mentioned blockchain a couple of times. Any type of distributed ledger is really what we're seeing kind of emerge in this space. It doesn't have to be blockchain oriented necessarily. But that's the sort of the technology stack that we're beginning to see emerge that's enabling some of this. It's quite simplistic, and a lot of it is based around that identity and authentication management piece.
I go back to some of that third world example that we were giving before, when a successful farmer can actually credentially prove that he or she is a successful farmer and therefore get more investment as a result. So these storage repositories are really adding and providing proof of the value that people would otherwise not see. So that's, again, another way to back the trust in the currency itself.
Absolutely, and taking that one stage further, the output of that farm can then be tagged with almost tokenized, so that you can track where it comes through the supply chain to the plate where you're eating the food from, so you know which farm it's come from. You have validation that it's a natural farm and they don't use pesticides, and all those sorts of things can be baked into the full supply chain of that asset, from the trusted farmer right through to the consumption point.
That's very true. I mean, I can remember there's issues with large corporations, saying, the chain of supply doesn't have blood money in it, or doesn't involve forced labor or other things like that. So again, it's that trust in the chain, and it allows you to say, well, I'll purchase from this trusted provider rather than this untrusted provider.
Absolutely, and it can work both ways as well. So I know organizations, I won't name them, who, when they're shipping bits of hardware, they'll validate every bit of hardware that's included in it. So when the customer comes back and says, I didn't get the GPUs or the RAM you promised me, there's an audit trail that says, yes, actually they were installed in the box. And we validated that at each stage of the supply chain, so we know either when it went missing, so who's profiting from our GPUs and memory, or the fact that the customer is just trying to try it on a little bit maybe and then get some new hardware for free. So it works both ways. It's good for both parties, and it's transparent all the way along. So to summarize then, financial transactions are changing. We are changing the way that we look at transactions. We're changing the way we exchange value. The personal transaction, so when you're selling something or buying something, you own that. You have full control over the values that you're exchanging, and it's not down to a third party to interject and therefore add cost when they do so. Identity ownership has to be digitized, though. We don't all have a single digital identity. Whether we end up with single digital identity or multiple digital identities is still something that's being played out, but it will be digitized. We need ways of identifying ourselves uniquely online that's not copyable, that's not transferable. Peer-to-peer and decentralized is driving this personal revolution. We're transacting with each other. We're not going through that central piece anymore. Decentralization started with blockchain and Bitcoin. Any kind of decentralized ledger now is being able to fill that role, but it's really driving this distribution of transactions to the edge. Data is the new currency for everything. We digitize everything, so the movement of that digital asset around, whether it's referring to a property or a car or a product, it's digitized. So the movement of that data is now the movement of that value, the movement of that asset. But it's a journey. We're iterating very quickly on it. Rich has talked about all the different phases that we're going through on this, but it's something that's evolving. We haven't got all the answers today. We haven't solved everything today, but we're beginning to see the changes. And as we experience these things, we're going to come across the challenges, like we saw with Rich and he's talking about the middleman attack he had there. Those sorts of things will become apparent as we use it. The bad people are just as inventive as the good people in this scenario, so we're keeping an eye on what new things are coming out in that space, and there's security being wrapped around those things, and experts like Jim and other folks that are looking at that and figuring out, well, how do we alter the process? How do we build other things around the safeguards around these things to take it forward in a safe way? But things are happening very quickly. So if we give this presentation again in a year's time, there'll be a lot more to add to it. So I just want to thank everyone for coming. Jim, I want to hand back to you to close out. Thank you.
Sure, and I think bringing it back to cloud storage and how does this affect cloud storage? I think that we see very clearly that those of you storing not only the trusted transactions but also storing the currency itself, you have the opportunity, like Glyn and Richard were saying, to do the analytics on both the data and the data flow to be able to derive your own value. And I think the implications of this are fascinating. This was a wonderful conversation. I certainly want to thank Richard and Glyn for doing this. Want to thank all of you for attending and all of you who are viewing it afterwards as well for sticking with us. After the webcast is pretty close to over. If you weren't here right at the beginning, under attachments and links to the right of your screen is the presentation itself. You can feel free to download it. We would appreciate you rating this webcast and providing us with feedback. At SNIA, we do several of these, and we take all your feedback, we read it all, and we act on as much of it as possible in order to be able to tailor our content to something that you want to view. So this webcast and a copy of the slides will be available also at the SNIA Educational Library, and you can see the link there, snia.org/educational-library. There is a wealth of content there, pun intended. And I think you should check out the Ed Library for a variety of great information on storage networking, as well as some of the trends that are going on in the industry. And we will also be summarizing this. There were a couple of questions or comments that I asked, and we saw some things come through. Thank you. And so we will post a post-webcast blog on the SNIA Cloud blog, and you can see that, sniacloud.com. And please follow us on Twitter at SNIA Cloud. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Have a great day, and we look forward to presenting to you again.